The United States is angry at China, and it's angry at China for many reasons, but this mainly surrounds now the Ukraine conflict. The United States is not happy with China's position. It's not happy that it's trying to broker peace. It's not happy that China has succeeded in brokering peace between countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's certainly not happy that Li Hui, the Chinese envoy, is traveling around respective parties in this conflict, in the Ukraine conflict, seeking a peaceful resolution. Not happy. Definitely the United States is not happy. So over the course of the last several months, of course, you've had many diplomatic issues between China and the United States. You had the balloon incident. You've also had the spy crane incident. And you've had over and over. Now you have the Micron chip controversy where China has banned Micron chip manufacturer, a U.S. manufacturer of advanced semiconductor chips, because of the national security risks that it poses. This is according to China. And the facts kind of back up China here, because the United States has been spying on Chinese tech and aviation for many, many years, according to WikiLeaks. But now the United States is not happy with China because China isn't talking to the Pentagon. So at the Shangri-La dialogue, which was supposed to be held in Singapore, the United States hoped that Lloyd Austin, defense chief of the United States, would be able to meet with his counterpart from China. China said not so fast. There will be no talks. And why is this? Well, there is, of course, the fact that China's defense minister, has been sanctioned, has been sanctioned by the United States for supposedly agreeing to supply weapons to Russia in the conflict. I don't know if you all remember, but this was something that was nonstop spoken about just earlier this winter into the spring. It was constant that China was providing weapons to Russia. China was thinking about providing weapons to Russia, and that led to diplomatic sanctions on China's defense ministry. So this was a red flag to China. And after the balloon incident, the so-called spy balloon incident, China cut off all kinds of communication, but especially around defense. And also, according to the United States, has not allowed Antony Blinken to make a visit to Beijing. China says that there was never any visit planned, but it's obvious that the United States has been making calls and saying, hey, can Antony Blinken visit? Can we have this dialogue, this meeting? It would make a lot of sense because European countries, many European leaders, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, you've also had Olaf Scholz, they've all made a trip to China. Many European countries have in the last several months, but the United States has not gotten any invitation. And according to the United States now, they're not picking up calls. So China is not picking up the United States' call. But not only is China not picking up the United States' call, it is preparing for what it's calling and what Xi Jinping is calling dangerous storms. So not only are relations on this front extremely cold right now, extremely frigid, but now China is saying, Xi Jinping is saying that its security chiefs need to prepare for dangerous storms. The president has warned that the country must prepare for worst-case scenarios as its security situation deteriorates. And so Xi Jinping is warning that China is facing increasingly difficult and complex national security challenges and must prepare for quote-unquote worst-case scenarios by increasing its capacity to deal with internal and external threats. This is what Xinhua news agency reported Xi Jinping saying this past Tuesday, that we must be prepared for worst-case and extreme scenarios and be ready to withstand the major test of high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms. He added that efforts were needed to modernize the nation's security architecture and get prepared for actual combat in dealing with practical problems. So I am not surprised by the headwinds, the choppy waters. This is how Chinese officials talk, and this is how Xi Jinping has been talking since he has come into power in China, but especially over the last 5 or so years in relation to the United States. But this is important, preparing for actual combat. And of course, there are many reasons why China will be preparing for actual combat, not least because the United States has hundreds of bases militarily surrounding China in various countries, Japan and South Korea holding the biggest U.S. Troop presence and base presence in the region. But also, the United States has been organizing these countries into de facto military alliances. South Korea is looking to dock nuclear submarines from the United States. Japan has increased its military budget 2, 3, 4-fold in order to satisfy the US's aim to contain China militarily. And of course, you have warships being sent into the Taiwan Strait seemingly every other day by the United States. And there is lots of war game simulations happening on the US side. So this, while many might become alarmed by Xi Jinping saying China needs to get prepared for actual combat and deal with practical problems, that's pretty reasonable given that China is militarily encircled and is being just legitimately under attack in this way. So Xi Jinping made his comments to the National Security Commission amid increasing tension with the U.S. And just this week, Beijing declined Washington's request for a meeting between the two countries' defense chiefs when both men attend a security conference in Singapore in June, citing the need for U.S. officials to respect China's sovereignty and security concerns. China cut off defense and climate ties with Washington last August over alleged meddling by U.S. officials in Taiwan. So that was August 2022 when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. It was seen as incredibly provocative because Taiwan, of course, is seen as part of China, as a country, China as a country that has a province of Taiwan. The One China principle has been violated over and over and over again by the United States. And there are, of course, concerns that the United States is supporting separatism there. And with Nancy Pelosi going over to meet Tsai Ing-wen last August, and then, of course, last month, you had Kevin McCarthy do the same thing, the current House Majority Speaker. That is an acknowledgement that Tsai Ing-wen, the president in Taiwan, in this autonomous region of China, is being viewed as a true diplomatic representative of a state-to-state visit. It's very concerning. And so China has been offended by this behavior. And of course, the United States has rubbed China's nose with it. So China's foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning demanded on Wednesday that the U.S. stops flying spy planes over the South China Sea, calling the flights dangerous provocations. Her statement came just one day after the U.S. Pacific Command accused China of causing a near collision by buzzing a fighter jet in front of an American reconnaissance plane in international airspace above the South China Sea. The South China Sea now, mind you, of course, is being always talked about in the Western mainstream media as being contested territory. But the fact remains that China actually has a right over at least portions of the territory of the South China Sea. That's why it's called the South China Sea. And that is just basic rules in international norms. The United States now has none of that. And of course, the United States brings up freedom of navigation and all of this based on economic interests and activity. And surely the South China Sea is one of the most important economic routes that exists in the world, where much of the trade by sea and by ocean occurs. However, the United States still has no jurisdiction politically there, but yet always attempts and has attempted for many years now to use its military force to influence the political and economic development occurring in the region surrounding the South China Sea. So the Pentagon has labeled China the most consequential systemic challenge to U.S. national security, an assessment that Beijing derided as an excuse to expand Washington's nuclear arsenal and maintain its hegemony. So Xi Jinping urges security chiefs to build up strategic self-confidence, improve the coordination of their operations, and utilize more advanced technology. He called for enhanced real-time monitoring of security threats, a better warning system, and improved handling of computer data and artificial intelligence. The complexity and severity of national security problems faced by our country have increased dramatically, said Xi Jinping. And who do you think Xi Jinping is talking about? He's not talking about Russia. He's not talking about countries that have maintained steadfast cooperation with China. He's talking about the United States and all of its vassal states, including those in the Asia Pacific, namely South Korea, Japan, Australia. All of these countries have sold themselves to the United States' aim of containing China and are shooting themselves, not just in the foot, they're shooting themselves straight in the gut. Not least because all of these countries depend on the Chinese market so heavily for their economies. Australia itself, export and import markets. China is the number one trading partner in both. South Korea needs China's market for semiconductor technology consumption because that's where all the manufacturing happens in China. And Japan, of course, needs China for economic cooperation as what once was a dynamic economy of Japan continues to spiral into the abyss. So all of these countries are selling themselves to the United States to some extent, but all of them do not want to decouple with China. So the complexity of these challenges is grave because it does threaten to destabilize the economic architecture that surrounds China. And while China has the ability to really cushion these blows because it is a sovereign country, it does have independent foreign and economic policy. It is not at the whims of US dollar domination. No, China does not need to depend on US finance and the US for economic development. It surely has been able to lift itself up out of poverty and develop rapidly. And I was listening actually to Scott Ritter on Jeff Norman in his program, U.S. Tour of Duty, and there was someone who I think from Moscow who asked, why doesn't the United States ally with either Russia and China against the other? And she mentioned that China doesn't have sanctions like Russia does. And while I agree that certainly Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, China is increasingly coming under, especially in this area of high tech, increasing sanctions from the United States. And these sanctions do make a difference. They do not have the same impact given China's overall position and ability to soften the blow, but they do have an impact, and they definitely have an impact on the world economy. So it's not just the military frontier that Xi Jinping is talking about. There is an economic component. There's a propaganda component. This is hybrid warfare, and it is escalating, and China is preparing on the military front as it should. U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has tried to stymie Chinese development of advanced semiconductor chips, at least partly because of their importance in advancing AI technology. Those measures have included restrictions on exports of semiconductors and advanced chip-making equipment to China. And then they talk about the Micron technology ban, the largest U.S. maker of computer memory chips, citing significant security risks. Some observers interpreted the move as a retaliation for Washington's effort to contain China's chip-making industry. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo responded by saying Washington won't tolerate the ban. So there's a lot of hand-wringing going on here. There's a lot of hand-wringing going on here by the United States. They're attempting to assert their control and their domination over China. And that's because China is the principal target, but China is getting prepared. And so if we look at the United States as a declining empire, if we look at the United States for what it is, as a failed state, as a failed regime, it's working as designed, but its regime is failing in many respects. So Ukraine is really just one front for this level of failure. Ukraine will not end up how the United States hoped it would go. And if Ukraine is just a single or part of this litmus test, then what's going on with China should be very instructive, because as Xi Jinping says, these risks are becoming more complex, they're becoming graver and bigger by the day. And that's because the United States knows that it's losing. It understands that it has no capability of arresting the Chinese economy. These sanctions on China, while not as numerous as on Russia, have attempted to curtail China's economic progress. I think the United States knows that if it were to sanction China like it did Russia, that the US economy would enter recession immediately. So it's tried to sanction China in a way that allows it to maintain predominance in certain areas like technology. But that ship has largely sailed. I've shown you that 37 out of the 44 advanced technologies in the world now belong to China in terms of who is leading this development worldwide. Who is leading this kind of tech development worldwide? It's China. And that's from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, certainly no friend of China, given that its Australian Defense Department and US State Department and US military contractor funds are all used and have been used to demonize and smear China over and over and over again, and go after journalists and even Twitter users by collaborating with Twitter who say the wrong thing about, for example, Xinjiang and so-called Uyghur genocide, right? So we know that the ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is no friend of China, but yet it has to admit that China is in fact a world leader in high tech. And that's why the United States has been targeting tech so intensely, but it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked and it won't work, because what's actually going to happen, and what we already see happening, is the producers of semiconductor markets of the technology, this advanced technology, are going to suffer mightily. So the United States will attempt as it may to organize Taiwan and its separatist leaning government, and it'll try to organize South Korea and Japan. Except Japan has instituted an export ban of its own. It's going to try to organize all of these countries to adhere to things like export bans and look to the United States as the possible next market. The problem with this is that actually the United States does not have the capacity to increase the part of the supply chain within its own domestic economy that China now occupies, both consumption and manufacturing, not of the advanced technology, but of the products that this technology is then employed in. So your phones, your tablets, your computers, a lot of these are produced in China. And the market to purchase them, the vast majority, the most important market, is China. So you isolate China, then you isolate yourself. You shoot yourself in the foot, you shoot yourself in the stomach, and eventually you're going to have big problems. And that's why the military front is so important for the United States. And so Xi Jinping is warning us. He's warning all of us, not just the Chinese people, not just the defense ministry of China. He is warning the world that China's security interests are very important and they are preparing for a major power conflict. How could they not prepare for a major power conflict? It would be absurd not to. And China has been, and I'm just going to pull this up really quick. It's not just tech, it's not just economic and military conflict that the United States is seeking. It really is diplomatic influence and political influence. The United States empire would fall in a day if it could not control the narrative, if it couldn't control how people think and behave, especially within the epicenters of its influence, in the United States itself, and of course all of its allied, so-called allied or vassal countries. It would fall in a minute. But here we have, I think, the most important challenge that China presents to the United States. Sure, economically, and you know, cash is king. The United States' economic supremacy, the profits of its big multinationals, of its military-industrial complex. I'm not going to minimize that. I'm not going to say that that isn't primary here. But what really has to be understood and considered is how China's economic ascendance is coupled with its diplomatic and political ascendance as a counterweight and as an alternative to US leadership in its totality, not just in one or another area. And here with Ukraine, I think we have seen that quite dramatically be exposed for more and more people to see, because the Ukraine conflict is such a tectonic ground breaking development. So in just the recent days, right, you have Li Hui, the Chinese envoy. He's been going around. He's been in Brussels. He's been in Ukraine. I'm sure he's been speaking to his Russian counterparts. He is attempting to spearhead what China said it was going to do, which is come up with a peace proposal. It came out with a list of principles, and now it is seeking to apply them with those parties involved and interested. The problem here is that the United States, Europe, the EU, NATO countries, for the most part, at least the European vassals of the West, and Ukraine are not interested in. And this is just another example of that. So, reported not too long ago, within the last week, you had Li Hui is told in Brussels that the EU expects China to press Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine. And he's faced a consistent message during his extended tour through Europe that started last week in Kiev with a meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. So that's been the consistent message that he's gotten. In a sense, the collective West has said, and Ukraine, of course, parroting this maybe the loudest because they can play the victim here, parroting this notion that Russia needs to surrender and that China needs to be the one to broker that peace will only come if Russia surrenders and unconditionally withdraws from all of Ukraine's territories. I mean, an absolute farcical and downright insulting thing to request of China. But nonetheless, that's where we're at. And I think that the response to this, the response to China's peacemaking efforts is very emblematic of the security challenges that China faces. China is being talked down to. China is being told, do what we say. And when you don't, you will be military encircled, you will be sanctioned, and you will be targeted for war. So a top European Union official has used a high-profile meeting with the Chinese envoy in Brussels to press Beijing again to use its leverage with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Li Hui, Beijing's special envoy for Eurasian affairs and is leading the China's peacemaking efforts, met Enrique Mora, the EU's Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs, on Thursday. So this was late May. After the meeting, the EU said that Mora had stressed the necessity to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. The EU expects China to play a constructive role and use every occasion to uphold and promote the UN Charter and international law, and to recall the necessity to respect the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, said the EU chief. So this is rich. The United States is, I say the United States, it's the European Union, but at this point, the foreign policy is literally the same. But you have the EU here richly, unironically, lecturing China about the UN Charter. Lecturing China about the UN Charter. These countries have all participated. The decimation, the EU countries, destruction of Yugoslavia, destruction of Libya, destruction of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. We go on and on and on. Ukraine, all of these wars that the European so-called garden has attempted to wage. None of that was done with respect to the UN Charter. But yet, here we are with China being the one lectured, despite the fact that China has even been in a military conflict in more than 40 years. And that was a very short skirmish with Vietnam. And so in retrospect, China really hasn't fought a war since, you could maybe say that the United States and China got really close during the first and second Taiwan Strait crises. But it really hasn't been since World War II, to be quite frank. So it's ridiculous that China is being lectured here on this issue. But the expectation includes efforts by Beijing to get Russia to stop the bloodshed and indiscriminate targeting of civilians by immediately and unconditionally withdrawing all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The statement did not include any details of Li's response, and Beijing did not immediately release its own readout of the meeting. Mora's comments were in line with a warning by the EU's top diplomat Josep Borrell earlier in May that Beijing cannot expect to be good friends with the bloc without Chinese efforts to end Russia's assault against its neighbors. Again, this is the security challenges that China faces. China is a world leader now. China has the respect of all countries, including Ukraine and Russia's, mind you. I don't know if you all watched my segment on the Xi Jinping Zelensky phone call, But if you read that readout, you will see that Zelensky did not have anything bad to say about China. And of course, he's been critical. He spouts off with the mouth. He's not coherent. He doesn't have any one political position, and everything is opportunism for Zelensky. But nonetheless, Ukraine has to respect China because of the economic relations that they have. Russia, of course, and China's partnership is not only strategic and comprehensive, but it's maybe one of the biggest and strongest partnerships that the world has right now, bilaterally and, of course, multilaterally. They do so much work together. So this is a consistent message that Li Hui has faced on this front throughout his extended trip through Europe, which started in Kiev with a meeting with Vladimir Zelensky and other senior officials. Zelensky's office posted a lengthy statement after his meeting with Li, promoting a 10-point formula it put forward in November, which demands Russia's withdrawal and return of all territory seized by Moscow. Similar messaging during subsequent stop on Li's tours have been underscored by Borrell, with Borrell issuing that warning we said earlier. So France and Germany, largest EU members, have said European policies toward China should not necessarily be in lockstep with Washington. So this is just a summary now of other developments. But the point is that China, as it ascends, it's not just the military front, but as it ascends to this role of being a leader on the diplomatic front, it is being undermined again by the United States. The United States does not want to see peace in Ukraine. The United States is looking to continue to assert its hegemony. It wants Ukraine to do what Ukraine was always supposed to do in this context, which is do what the United States says. Do what the United States says. Be a puppet. Be a military outpost. Be a complete vassal state. Enter NATO eventually. And antagonize Russia so that they can build up to a larger war with Russia. And China is not going to agree to that. In that article, they said that China didn't respond to the message that Ukraine and the EU has been sending on this question of peace. Well, China doesn't have to, because China understands what its position is, and it doesn't have to get into a diplomatic row just because it's been told absolutely not, you're not going to negotiate peace. China is not going to be bullied by the United States, by the EU, by any of these forces into coaxing Russia to do anything, because China has repeatedly said that Russia's security interests also need to be respected. So there's going to have to be major compromise, of course, on all sides. But given the battlefield situation, it's pretty clear that China understands who's going to need to be doing more of the compromising. And that's Ukraine, that's NATO, that's the EU, that's the United States. But China has its own set of concerns, and that's why it is preparing militarily to defend itself from what is the next major storm, and that is potential war between the United States and China over Taiwan, and of course over the entirety of the Asia Pacific, because the Asia Pacific right now is a battleground, just like Eurasia, just like Eastern Europe, just like the former Soviet states, and the Central Asian countries. All of those countries are a battleground for the United States' impending hot war with Russia. The same goes for the Asia Pacific with China. This is a new Cold War. This is not hyperbole. This is not an attempt to mislead. This is a new Cold War, and the United States understands that very much so. And if it because it's taking all of these actions to do so, and that's to amplify one. And that's what's most important here. And I'll just end this story here. The most important thing to understand about China's security concerns, China preparing for war, is that we have to heed what China's leadership, Xi Jinping, Mao Ning, so many of its spokespeople and officialdom have said about the United States and have said about Europe, have said about countries that have expressed very contradictory messages about China. China has said over and over again, it's not about what you say, it's about what you do. So it's not about what Macron says about strategic autonomy, it's about what he does. It's not about what the United States says about possibly freezing the Ukraine conflict and thawing relations with China. It's about what Joe Biden and his administration does. And if we just look at what they do, all of these countries, but especially the United States, you can see that none of it points to diplomacy, to peace, to thawing relations. None of it does. It all points to making the situation worse, escalating conflict, and sparking war. That's where the United States and China are at right now. The United States has placed all of its military marbles into the jar of destroying China, and it is overflowing, and eventually it's going to fall off of a cliff and break, meaning that there will be a war. Those marbles will go everywhere. It's going to be chaotic. And the United States is set to lose that conflict. And that's what's the most concerning thing, not because the United States shouldn't lose. The United States has lost many conflicts in its history, many wars that it has waged. Syria, Afghanistan, Korea, Vietnam. We can go on and on and on. The United States is not necessarily a winner. It likes to pose itself as the most exceptional, the most dominant, the most civilized, all of this nonsense. But it has been a pretty big loser in many respects over the course of the decades, even since it became the hegemon after World War II. But the scary thing should be that the more the United States loses, the more predatory, the more dangerous it becomes, because it has that finger on the nuclear button. It does. The United States is the one country that's used nuclear weapons, and it's the one country that has threatened the use of nuclear weapons repeatedly over the last 7 decades. And it is the country that continues to escalate tensions to the point where such a nuclear catastrophe would be possible again, whether it's through withdrawing from treaties or whether it's from encircling nuclear powers like Russia and China militarily. So this is where things are at. China is preparing for the worst. We should all be preparing for the worst, because unless we're telling people that the worst is coming, they're not going to be prepared, especially in the land of propaganda and misinformation that is the collective West. So that's what's important about, it's not about negativity or pessimism, because that truly is some of the most pessimistic you will hear Xi Jinping on any issue. But it's not about pessimism. It's about realism. And the reality is that conflict is much closer than we may be able to feel tangibly at this moment. And we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared to speak out, call for, demand, and act on the opposite, for peace, for true self-determination, multipolarity, the principles of the UN Charter, however you want to frame it. That's what we need to be doing each and every day, wherever and however we can, whenever we can. That truly is the mission for humanity, and should be for humanity's future.